Well, good morning, everybody. I've been delegated to take you through a really whistle-stop tour through the history of SSRS, covering some of the ground much more quickly than that you've just heard from Jenny Bryce. So just to recap, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the devastating loss of red squirrels from the UK in the face of grey squirrel expansion. I mean, it's probably one of the most dramatic losses of a species that's happened, and you know, it's very complete. There's hardly anything left in the wake of the grey squirrels. So, you know, it's quite a dramatic thing that's been happening. Looking a little bit more closely at the Scottish situation, and in particular the decades leading up to 2009, which was the year that Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels was launched, we can see that this process of grey squirrel expansion was already well underway and was continuing in those decades. So on the left-hand map, we're looking at 10-kilometre squares with red or grey squirrel present. So we've got the reddish colour, which is obviously where we've just got red squirrels. The purple is where both species exist, and the grey is where it's just grey squirrels. So you can see that in the 1990s, pretty much every 10k square across Scotland, with a few exceptions there, that had suitable habitat, you would have been able to find red squirrel in that 10k square. By the time we get to the 20, I don't know how you say this, the 2000s, the 2000s is, you can see that we've got now a patch across the central belt that actually has no red squirrels left at all. So the replacement is happening at this stage in the central belt. And you can also see that in the same time scale, we're getting a huge expansion of range across Dumfries and Galloway, not in huge numbers at this stage, but you know, they are appearing in each of the squares, and that's the great consolidation of the range and expansion of the range in the northeast there. So this process is very much in action at the time, you know, in the decades that are running up to when we launched Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels. So the mechanism for most of Scotland has been just by sheer competition for food and living space, grey squirrels have outcompeted reds. But it's not until 2005 that we get this additional threat of squirrelpox coming into the southern half of Scotland. And so now we have disease-mediated competition. And modelling has taken place, which suggests that once you get squirrelpox within a grey squirrel population, the rate of replacement can speed up by as much as 25 times. So that makes a huge difference, and that probably accounts for some of the incredible speed of replacement that's happened across the last century in the rest of the UK. I mean, it has been quite remarkable as an example of species replacement. So, looking at the evolution of red squirrel conservation initiatives, well, it all kicks off with the Rio Earth Summit back in 1992, at which the world's nations agreed that the primary responsibility for looking after native biodiversity lay with the governments of those nations. So this is where finally it's decided who has the responsibility. So on the back of that, we get the UK Biodiversity Action Plan being developed in 1995. That's followed by the Scottish Strategy for Red Squirrel Conservation that Benny already mentioned. In 1999, squirrelpox sampling starts in the south of Scotland. So a number of landowners are controlling grey squirrels and collecting blood samples, sending them off for testing, even as early as 1999. Now, at that point, we didn't have squirrelpox in Scotland, but we knew it was on its way. It was coming closer. And so we wanted to be ready for it so that we could do something about it once it arrived. So in 2001, the long-running Red Squirrels in South Scotland project starts. And now initially that's about public outreach and education packs for schools, etc. But you know, as we get closer to the point where squirrelpox is becoming quite close to our borders from 2001, they start to coordinate this squirrelpox testing that's going on in the south of Scotland. 2004, the Scottish Squirrel Survey starts, and this is a Scottish Natural Heritage funded initiative. And this was really to establish where exactly red and grey squirrels were across the whole of Scotland. And the two maps of Scotland with the 10K squares came from that survey. And then, as we've heard, in 2005, we get the first Squirrelpox seropositive happening. If you can see my pointer, it's down here on the, if you can see the pointer actually. It's down here by Canonbie, right on the border with Cumbria, and it starts to then spread up the wooded river valleys. 2006, as a result of this, the Red Squirrels in South Scotland project appoints their first professional grey squirrel officers. Now, there's a couple of guys that were appointed then who are still with the project, and they are perhaps our longest serving members of staff. And if anybody in the world knows anything about controlling grey squirrels in the presence of red squirrels, these guys are your experts. They have the most experience of anybody globally, probably. Now, the idea at this stage was to try and contain the spread of squirrelpox. So the thinking was, if the control got in ahead of the squirrelpox spread early enough, you could prevent the squirrelpox from expanding and from getting into the central belt, because it was thought it was going to be, a disaster. We thought we would see the same terrible replacement in Scotland that we've already seen in the rest of the UK. Now, in the same year, the Scottish government comes up with its costed action plan, which Jenny's already helpfully described, so I won't spend any further time on that. 2009, Scottish Natural Heritage now conducts a public consultation on a strategy that's been developed on where the best place, if we've got to choose where we put grey squirrel control because of the expense of it, where are the best places? What is going to deliver the most benefit to red squirrels across Scotland? And it's come up with, as you know already, trying to contain this population that's spreading out from Aberdeen and containing the Highland Line and trying to prevent any further expansion across the Highland Line. In the south, it's all about squirrelpox management. So finally, in 2009, we get the launch of Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels, phase 1. So it's a partnership project, and you can see the 5 partners in this by the logo at the bottom there that we started off with. So the work that we started doing at that point was based on work by local initiatives throughout Scotland. So we took a lot of know-how from the Red Squirrels in South Scotland project, but also from other projects, the Highland Red Squirrel Project, Fife Red Squirrel Project, and others. Now, our role, as Jenny has already said, was that this is, say, the SSRS role, was to deliver the grey squirrel control and the public engagement aspects of this costed government action plan. So during this time, we set up the systems so that we could deliver this plan. And so you can see in this map with the green splodges on the right, this was the footprint that we managed to develop during phase 1. So this represents all the landowners who are either trapping on their own land, allowing us access to trap, or they're doing monitoring or allowing monitoring. So, we have a huge footprint of landowners and others, volunteers as well in these areas, who are out there collaborating with the project in various ways. So the idea really was to have strategically located landscape scale networks. And I'll keep coming back to this landscape scale. It's really what's important here. That consisted of, as I say, staff, landowners, and volunteers. Now, during the first phase of SSRS, we developed the first standardized surveys that we were running every spring until COVID interrupted it. And so you can see in this bottom map that you can see about 100 tetrads, 2 by 2 kilometer squares, where we're doing surveys at the same time every year so that we can keep a check on how we're doing with our grey squirrel control programs. So just having a look at some of the early results from this first phase of the project. The tetrad surveys are showing overall that we're getting an increasing distribution of red squirrels and a decreasing distribution of grey squirrels. So this is what we want to see. We're also looking at our trapping results, and we found that cumulative trapping, and specifically the number of years that you trap at any particular location, causes a reduction of grey squirrel numbers locally. And so this little graph on the right at the top is showing the decline of the grey squirrel capture rate, which is a sort of proxy for grey squirrel densities on the site. And it falls very rapidly in the first year that you're trapping in a site, and then it'll gradually level off. So we had 5 years that we looked at for this red line, which is in the northeast of Scotland, where we had locations that had been trapped for 5 consecutive years. And then in the central lowlands, we'd only had 2 years of trapping. So fortunately, we're getting the same very rapid drop off in the first phase of the trapping, the first couple of years of trapping. So red squirrels in South Scotland, they're on phase 4 by now. So don't forget they started in 2001. So they've been going a while by then. And what we were able to show with the help of other scientists is that grey squirrel control was effective at limiting the severity of pox outbreaks in red squirrels. If you could prevent grey squirrels from just keeping on moving and occupying space vacated by local populations that had died, then you could actually contain the outbreak. It didn't travel too far. So we also found that grey squirrel control decreased the rate of spread of squirrelpox throughout South Scotland to an extent. It was still very rapid, I have to say. But the modelling that we were able to do modelled the situation without control and the situation with control, and so we were able to confirm that it had been worthwhile controlling grey squirrels. It slowed that spread. Now, for the next phase, SSRS phase 2, we merged the SSRS and the Red Squirrels in South Scotland projects. And at this point, we decided that instead of just testing for squirrelpox just ahead of the current spread of the squirrelpox in grey squirrels, we would then start sampling right across the grey squirrel range in Scotland. So we set up these 20k squares and chose one of the 10k squares in it to collect samples. So now we've got a sort of national squirrelpox monitoring scheme. Also in phase 2, we extended our tetrad surveys to cover the south. So again, we've got about another 100 or so, slightly more than 100 tetrads across the south of Scotland. And this map was the first year that we delivered the surveys in South Scotland. And I think we were all kind of surprised, or certainly I was surprised to find that there were a lot of red-only squares. It's not the impression we were having. And I think this is probably because grey squirrels occupy the same sort of places that people do. So our sightings were mainly of grey squirrels coming back. Red squirrels are sort of excluded from those areas. So they're occupying dense forests. And when we went to survey in those forests, we found that red squirrels were there, and they were there without grey squirrels. So this was a good finding. And then, as I say, we collaborated with external scientists, Andy White and Peter Lertz, who'll be talking later on their mathematical modelling of our data to look at the squirrelpox spread. So that was phase 2, which is a relatively short phase. Now, some of the learnings is that, from our very rough and ready graphs of the number of grey squirrels being caught, or the rate that grey squirrels are caught in a site over a number of years, we now get a demonstration of a significant reduction of grey squirrels in relation to this control effort that was done by Dr. Matt Oliver, who's an external scientist using our data. So now we've got scientific and statistically validated proof that this is actually happening. And here's some of the outputs of the modelling that I mentioned in South Scotland, which demonstrated that although the control successfully slowed down the rate of squirrelpox, it was never going to, if we just wouldn't have the scale of control effort needed to stop the spread. So ultimately, the prediction is that it will at some point spread throughout all the grey squirrels in Scotland, bar Aberdeen, because at the moment we've got 30 kilometres that are between Aberdeen and the rest of the UK's grey squirrel populations. So one of the things that came out of from our own observations and from that was also confirmed by the modelling work was that grey squirrel control is enabling red squirrels to survive, and not just survive, but actually really thrive in these landscapes in the south of Scotland that had an endemic squirrelpox in the grey squirrels. So now we know that we've got a tool here. So we don't have to just sit back and watch squirrelpox sweep through Scotland and lose our red squirrels to grey squirrel encroachment. We have a tool. We can actually control the grey squirrels too. And that does have the effect of keeping red squirrels, providing you can keep doing it. So now we're on to phase 3. So at this point, RSPB joins the SSRS partnership at the time when RSPB moved from just birds to all of nature. So at this point, as we've decided we can't stop the spread of squirrelpox in South Scotland, we decided we'd refocus our efforts on just focus on maintaining the red squirrels. You know, the red squirrels had been maintained as a result of our squirrelpox containment efforts in the south of Scotland. Now we would just focus our efforts actually on helping and enhancing the red squirrel populations. And we chose the landscapes that we'd already been working on for squirrelpox containment. So these purple lozengey things that you can see in the map are where we had landowners on the grant system trapping originally for squirrelpox management, but now refocused for red squirrel management. If you can see the little yellow triangles in here, this is where we had our control officers. And of course, we needed a good red squirrel resource. So the red dots are red squirrels that were in all these areas. Now, these areas that we chose to call them priority areas for red squirrel conservation, but parks for short. So at this point, we also modified our systematic squirrelpox monitoring just to monitor from the central belt northwards. We know now that if we monitor in the south, we'll find that there's squirrelpox present pretty much in most of the 10K squares. So we stopped monitoring there. We collaborated on some further disease and population modelling with Andy White and Peter Lertz, looking at what we needed to do to prevent grey squirrels and squirrelpox from crossing the Highland line boundary. So that was a useful output. And the major lesson that we have learned from the projects up to this point is that sustained, coordinated landscape scale control will need to continue for the long term. And here we're talking decades, if Scotland's red squirrel populations are to remain protected. And so you can see I've said, how do we do this? So to bring some of the answer to how we do this, the partners, the SSRS partners, came up with the Developing Community Action Project. Now, this was a 5-year project that we've just come into the end of. This is our final year that will end at the end of March. It's made possible really by a large amount of funding from the National Lottery, the Heritage Fund. Plus, we still have funding from all our other partners and from elsewhere. So the strategic aims are the same as they've been since 2009, when SNH came up with its strategy, is to protect this big red-only population. It's easier to stop grey squirrels getting in than to try and get rid of them once they've got in. So try and keep this red-only as long as we can. And initially, we were thinking of shrinking or just containing this isolated population of grey squirrels on Aberdeen. Now we're going to push for eradication. That's the idea, because they're kind of behind our front line across the Highland line here, where we're aiming to contain any further spread of grey squirrels and to mop up these ones that have managed to get to the north of the line then. So in the south, we're looking at reducing grey squirrel densities to prevent the replacement of red squirrels in these parks that we've identified. So looking at the priority areas that we had 8 initially, and we added a couple to them during the course of the DCA project, Developing Community Action Project. You'll hear people say DCA, so that's what it means. Some of them are very small. This is the Berwickshire Park, and really that's intended to protect this red squirrel stronghold in England on the Northumberland border, Northumberland coast there. I think it's Kylo there. So it's a heading off grey squirrels from the Scottish side of the border. But some of them are just massive landscapes. You know, they are quite ambitious to want to protect these landscapes, and we increased some of them. This is Glen Kens. We expanded that one, and there's a couple of others, small ones that are really about heading off grey squirrels incursion into Dumfries and Galloway. So the great thing about the south of Scotland is that there are some very big areas of red squirrel preferred habitat in which grey squirrels don't do very well. So they are likely to hold on to red squirrels over the long term, but they're also not terribly good for red squirrels either. But they can manage, grey squirrels can't. So having these control networks in the kind of lowland, the grey squirrel preferred habitat is keeping a supply of red squirrels to recolonize should the worst come to the worst in some of these big conifer habitats. But how on earth are we going to cover such a huge landscape over the long term? Well, for the past 5 years, as we've already mentioned, we've had a huge project staff. We've had, over the course of SSRS, over 200 landowners collaborating under forestry grant scheme contracts. And we developed a trap loan scheme, first developed by Red Squirrels in South Scotland, but it's now become, the backbone of what we're doing, particularly in the south of Scotland. And, I can't emphasize enough the crucial role of individual volunteers and landowner partners in maintaining these massive landscape scale levels of control alongside our own control people. So in the developing community action, it's about raising awareness, partly the wider community of Scotland. If you're doing something that's a little bit controversial, like grey squirrel control, you need the backing of Scotland's public behind you. It's about recruiting new volunteers. It's been about establishing local community red squirrel networks. We had 5 set up at the beginning of DCA, and we now have 18. It's about providing the resources to those groups of community networks and the training and mentoring and key skills so that we're enabling those groups, as Sarah said in the lovely film that was shown earlier, about getting the groups to be self-sufficient at protecting their local red squirrels. Plus, we also developed a very ambitious online resource, the SSRS Community Hub, that had a data managing capacity for volunteers to use and feedback summaries and managing their work time and so forth on their volunteering time on that hub. So that's where we've got up to. So now I think from here, I'm going to hand over to my team, who are going to tell you about some of the detail and some of what has been going on in their specific areas.